On November 3rd, 1978, a beautiful 19-year-old young woman by the name of Theresa Allore completely disappeared from her college campus in the small borough of Lennoxville, Quebec, located approximately 2 hours east of Montreal. Upon being discovered missing, police and school officials determined it wasn't necessary to coordinate a search party to look for her, not around the campus, nor the surrounding areas. 5.5 months later, her body was found, only a few kilometers away from her campus residence. How she got there was unknown. How she died was also unknown. Now, almost 40 years later, her family is still searching for answers, trying to unravel the mysterious circumstances around her disappearance and cause of death. This unexplained tragedy leaves behind a shattered family, still grappling for the truth, unable to put her to rest. So how did Theresa disappear? And more importantly, how did she die? Why had police and school officials refused to search for her? Join us now as we dig for answers into the cold case of Theresa Allore, untangling possible clues, motives, suspects, and theories into her disappearance and subsequent death. Theresa Allore was an intelligent 19-year-old college student attending her 8th week at Champlain College Regional School in Lennoxville, Quebec. It was her first year there, and she'd been excited for what was supposed to be a fresh start for her. By all accounts, Theresa was an adventurous, strong-willed, happy-go-lucky teenager. Her younger brother John, who was only 5 years younger, loved being around her, and recalls what it was like growing up with her in a small Canadian suburb town of Quebec.
The community was of the West Island of Montreal. I think it was how anyone else grew up in the suburbs in many ways. So we lived next to the railway tracks. You crossed the railway tracks, you know, there was like swampland over there and fields and etc. So that was our playground.
The Allore children grew up in the 70s. A time when communities felt safer, neighbors knew one another, the kids played together in the streets. Parents didn't feel the need to be overly protective or worrisome about where their kids were playing at any given time. That's just the way it was.
We sort of lived on a block, and you know, there's several families there. We were all friends. You know, it was sort of thing where we played each other's houses and borrow each other's toys. We walked to school, went to the local elementary school. We played hockey. I remember hide-and-go-seek games around the neighborhood that would increasingly go on for blocks and blocks and go later and later into the night. If we had a curfew, I'm not aware of it. So I would characterize it as the typical childhood in a Canadian suburb.
And as the little brother, John adored his sister and absolutely loved spending time with her. Because of their age difference, there was little for them to have conflict about.
I completely idolized her. What I remember, well, she permitted me to come with her on a bike ride. She permitted me to go downtown with her and even, you know, act as my chaperone. So my memories of her are really, really good. It's all about fun. I mean, a huge practical joker. She loved those kind of things. She loved puzzles and games and wordplay and all of that.
As much as John loved his big sister's humor, he also loved her sense of adventure. But that side of her was also the side he stated constantly pushed the boundaries of their parents' authority. John told us that Theresa would often hitchhike to get to where she wanted to go, something her parents did not condone.
This freaked my parents out an awful lot. They would often warn her about hitchhiking. You just don't do it. In that era, it was commonly done. That was your mode of transportation. You didn't have a car. No bus or train ran on a reliable schedule. So why not do this?
Despite being warned by their parents not to hitchhike, John tells us about a time when Theresa attempted to do it with him in tow.
I recall one incident in particular where she wanted to go downtown. So typically you take a train to downtown Montreal, take you about a half hour to get there. The agenda was something like, let's look at the toy shops, let's go to the greatest record store on St. Catherine, let's have lunch somewhere, and then we got to get home. And on the way home, I don't know why this happened. She decided we weren't going to take the train, that we were going to hitchhike. And I remember standing on the entranceway to the highway with our thumbs out, and we weren't getting picked up. And Theresa said, "You go hide in the bushes." And I did. And, at this time, she's, I guess, 17, something like that. It's a very attractive young woman. And sure enough, within minutes, a truck stops. So she goes to get in the cab. I run out of the bushes. The guy in the truck sees me and decides, no, that's not what I wanted. I didn't want this girl and Junior. I wanted the girl. And so he drove off and left us. But very early on, that was a telling sign to me that things might be more dangerous out there than you'd expect.
John also tells us about other times when Theresa rebelled against her parents, going on over 100-kilometer bike rides, crossing over the Quebec border, and sometimes even going camping all on her own. Not something typically tackled by a young woman in the 70s. Theresa's parents didn't completely know how to gain control of the strong-willed, thrill-seeking daughter. As to be expected, some friction started to develop between them. Teenagers generally attempt to gain a degree of independence during this stage, but Theresa seemed to do so in a manner unusual for a girl her age, and especially during that era. Somewhere along the line, John says, things hit a bit of a tipping point.
So for a period, dropped out of school. She was working at a McDonald's for a while, not great prospects. She was working at a ski factory. And she got a taste of what, life was going to be like without an education. There had been a lot of, obviously, conflict in our house because she was coming up in the late 70s. And I think that was a very confusing time for my parents, who were brought up, the 40s and 50s. And I don't think knew how to deal with it. Eventually, Theresa moved out. She lives on her own in an apartment, as I say, and worked these sort of trade jobs.
When Theresa moved out, she moved to Montreal and was living with a roommate. During one of her jobs at a ski shop, she met a young guy named Vlad from Calgary, who soon became her boyfriend. And for a time, she was happy. She was living like an adult. No rules. She could be her carefree self and not have to worry about upsetting her parents with her adventuresome ways. But at some point, Theresa decided that wasn't the path she wanted for herself. She decided she wanted to return to school, but she knew she wouldn't be able to afford it on her own, and she approached her parents for help.
She came back to my mother and she said, "I want to go back to school. If I go back, will you pay for it?" And my parents said, "Yeah, of course we will." So by the time she finds herself at Champlain College in the fall of 78, she had settled down considerably. By the time she reached, 18, she sort of sowed all her wild oats in the 4 years previous. Did she smoke pot? Yes. Did she, drink underage? We all did. By the time she went back to school, she was dedicated. People at that school have mentioned that she was more mature than anyone else. And not just because she was a year older than because she dropped out of school. She was an excellent student. She's a straight A student when all of this happened.
so with her parents' assistance, she was enrolled at Champlain College in the eastern township of Quebec. Her other brother Andre, who was only a year younger than her, was also enrolled at the same school. The Champlain campus itself was located in a very tiny borough of Sherbrooke called Lennoxville. In fact, it's so tiny that in the 70s there was virtually nothing there. A few cross streets, maybe one motel, a dry cleaner's, a bar, a couple of corner stores, and that's it. However, where Theresa and her brother lived was just off campus. Kings Hall was a residence about 15 kilometers away from the main campus in a small town called Compton. During that time, Kings Hall housed about 240 Champlain students. About 100 students lived in the main building, while the remaining 140 students were housed in an adjacent building called the Gillard House. An important thing to note is that for the students living off campus, the only form of transportation available was a 20-minute shuttle bus that ran every hour between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. But if you missed the 6 p.m. bus, the next one didn't arrive at the school until 11 p.m. So if you didn't want to wait for the 11 o'clock shuttle bus, your only choices were to either pay for an expensive cab ride, walk, or hitchhike. Most students opted for hitchhiking, which the college actually condoned. In fact, they didn't only condone it, they gave tips on how their students could do it safely in their school handbook. One of Theresa's classmates, named Suzanne, recalls what the handbook stated.
Not to hitchhike alone. We were always told that we had to hitchhike in pairs. Suggested not to hitchhike in the dark. To be wary of whose car we got into.
On the Friday morning of November 3rd, 1978, at 8 a.m., took the first shuttle bus over to the main campus in Lennoxville. On that day, she decided to wear a white t-shirt, blue corduroy pants that she'd borrowed from a friend, and a beige knee-length sweater. She went sockless and wore a pair of Chinese slippers, along with a long, dark green scarf she'd been given as a birthday gift when she turned 19. Theresa was an attractive young woman. She had big, beautiful blue eyes and shoulder-length, wavy red hair. Her skin was porcelain white, peppered with adorable freckles. Her brother John describes her as being beanpole thin. Her classmates described her as someone with a bubbly personality, always smiling, a twinkle in her eye, and always happy-go-lucky. It seemed anyone who knew her loved being around her. She just had that magnetic, warm type of personality. Well, after attending 2 classes that morning, Theresa later went to the main dining hall for lunch, where she had a brief conversation with her brother Andre. She then spoke with 2 of her friends.
She's seen there by a couple of friends, and the conversation goes something like this. One girl says, "Hey, do you want to come to my parents' place in Hemingford for the weekend?" Theresa says, "No, I have to study." 2 other girls say, "Do you want to come by our dorm room tonight around 9 o'clock? We're going to listen to records. We're going to listen to Cat Stevens and Peter Gabriel or something like that." Theresa says, "I have a book report to complete, but I might stop by later, maybe a little after 9. And then after the lunch, she has some classes. The last bus is leaving. I guess it's around 5 or 6, as I said. Somebody on the bus observes Theresa on the campus trying to catch the bus, and she misses it.
And that was the last time Theresa was seen alive. What's particularly unusual is how long it took for anyone to realize that she was even missing.
This is the thing. An entire week goes by before anyone considers that she's missing. And I think if I'm remembering it right, on the one hand, Theresa would often hitchhike and go back to Montreal. She had an apartment there. Well, she still had an association with that apartment. She knew the roommate. And so if she wanted to get away on a weekend, she'd often go back to Montreal. In fact, she had the week before done just that. She hitchhiked back to Montreal, stayed there the weekend, hitchhiked back to campus. And she didn't always hitchhike. Sometimes she would take the train. You could do that. So some people thought, typically, okay, Monday, maybe she's not in a class where she's supposed to be. Where's Theresa? Well, maybe she went to Montreal and maybe she decided to take another day, this kind of thing. The other thing is you got to realize is that she was new. She'd only been there for 8 weeks. So making new friends, and some of those new friends, they didn't know everything about her. They didn't know what her patterns were, etc. But I do find fault with one area of this, and that's the school. Surely they had a responsibility to know where their students were. Why was there no attendance taken, or, why didn't you do a dorm count, etc. Nevertheless, a full week goes by, and someone tells my brother, says, we haven't seen Theresa. And he's like, what do you mean you haven't seen Theresa? And they're like, well, nobody's seen her. And so he immediately phones my mother.
Theresa's mother then instructed Andre to go immediately to the director of the school and inform him that his sister had gone missing and to do a search. But when he did, Andre recalls the director responding by saying,
he just told me no, that he wasn't going to turn the school upside down for this particular thing.
John was only 14 years old at the time and living with his parents in St. John, New Brunswick, when his sister went missing. He tells us about the first time he heard she was gone.
I remember two things. One was I found out on November 11th. I was actually at a church service, for Remembrance Day, and I came home from that service. It was a school function. I came home from that service. I was hanging up my clothes in my room, and that's when my parents came into the room and said that Theresa was missing. And I just felt completely alone. My brother wasn't even there. I didn't even have him, because he was at school, to kind of sound things off or anything. And he must have been feeling the same. God, how I felt. Think how he must have felt, right? He's in the middle of it, completely alone. Doesn't know, who to trust. His parents aren't there. And he's being forced to act very quickly.
When the school refused to do a search for Theresa, her parents made their way to Quebec immediately, with John in the back seat of the car.
When we had made the drive to Lennoxville, and we were staying at this little motel called the Paysan. And the one thing I just remember, like, coming out at twilight and, just seeing the sky turning purple and, that she was out there. That image of the green trees, like, turning black because the night's coming and the sky being purple, that's what I remember.
Mr. Allore recalls other theories the school and police came up with, deeming it unnecessary to organize a search party for Theresa.
They started with character assassination and putting us on the defense, and they started with things like, was Theresa our child, or was she adopted?
Rather than to locate Theresa, they were trying to throw up excuses and subterfuge. And Theresa was, in their opinion, anywhere but in the vicinity of Lennoxville and Compton, because if she was in the vicinity of Lennoxville and Compton, it was their problem. It was the problem of these institutions. So if they could find any excuse to justify why she might not be there, that's what they were going to do. So immediately what's suggested is she's a runaway. She's gone out west to visit her boyfriend Vlad, who at this time was in Calgary and hasn't told anyone. She's decided to cross the border and go on a road trip down to visit friends in Florida. She's pregnant. She's pregnant and she's gone to a monastery, and she's going to be there until the child is born, and again all these tactics to shame the victim. And the worst one that was put forward, and I know because my dad wrote it down, the director of Champlain College said to my parents, Theresa obviously is a girl with lesbian tendencies, and she's gone to a place where those kind of people go. forget about what we think nowadays about LGBT, Q, and you know, we're a very evolved society now. Back then, even using that word was intentionally used to stigmatize. So, you know, I'm not even going to answer the question, was my sister gay or not? It's irrelevant, because that man had no knowledge of my sister's sexual preference, and he was deliberately trying to stigmatize the family.
Meanwhile, Mrs. and Mr. Allore had no other choice but to trust the possible theories that the authorities had come up with and proceed to search local monasteries in hope of finding their possibly pregnant but alive daughter. They frantically searched anywhere there was a possible lead to her whereabouts.
At this point, this is my parents kind of running around the eastern townships trying to get, you know, answers for themselves. So sure, you know, my dad did go to the local monastery, which is down around Owl's Head, and, you know, did knock on the door and say, do you have a young girl here? You know, they were very vulnerable and very prone to any suggestion. They'd never experienced anything like this. You were just being led by the nose, and I can see this from my dad's notes. Somebody describes a girl that looks like Theresa who's at a motel, and now we're 2 weeks into the disappearance. So of course my dad drives to that motel and shows her photo and all this. Missing persons pictures are being put up at the border. And then finally, this is going on, and a very inexperienced chief of police drops a story in the press that says Theresa Allore, her death might have had something to do with drugs, without any justification whatsoever. But again, it's more victim blaming and more stigmatization. What he was saying was maybe she overdosed. And again, it's like she was at a party and all this. So now it's not only Theresa's fault, it's students' fault. Well, this completely jeopardizes finding Theresa. What do you think the will is of a community to find her at that point? You know, at that point, people just kind of feel, well, she got what was coming to her. So any credit you might have had or sympathy you might have had in the community to come together and organize a search party or something like this is shot all to hell.
About a month goes by, and Theresa's parents were still unable to locate their teenage daughter anywhere, despite their perseverance. Mr. Allore recalls what an officer later advised him to do next.
He said that he didn't believe that we should be wasting our time like that. We should go home from where we came from, and that she would come out of the snowbank in the spring, and that's exactly what he said.
So Mr. and Mrs. Allore did just that. They went back to their home in St. John, New Brunswick, and waited and waited. They hoped and prayed that Theresa had indeed just run off to see her boyfriend in Calgary or friends in Florida, like the police officials suggested, that she had gone for a long visit to Montreal. As long as she was alive and well somewhere, that's all that mattered. But month after month after month went by, and still no word from Theresa. Christmas had come and gone, then Easter, and it was finally then, 5.5 months later, after the snow had melted, that Theresa was found. John relived with us the exact moment his parents received the phone call from the police. It was Friday the 13th, April 1979. They were in Trenton, Ontario, spending the Easter long weekend with their grandparents and extended family. Shortly after receiving the call, John and his brother Andre were quickly whisked away to spend the night with their cousin. When they returned to their grandparents' home, he remembers his parents breaking the most devastating news he could have ever imagined.
So finally around 4 o'clock, something like that, my cousin drops us off at my grandparents' place. We go in the back door as we always would, through the laundry room past the kitchen. I look to my right, and both my grandparents are sitting on the sofa, and they're in tears. So that's when I'm like, oh my God. So we walk down the hallway to the back bedroom where my parents typically stayed, and they're sitting on the bed in tears. And that's when they told us both that Theresa had been found and she was dead.
At that moment, John felt completely numb, unable to fully grasp what his parents had just told him, he was speechless.
I had like a little Kodak camera. I went outside and I took pictures of the clouds and the blue sky. Something in me wanted to capture the moment that I knew that she had died.
Theresa was found, face down, in a muddy bog, off the Quebec River, wearing only her bra and underwear. Just 2.5 kilometers down a gravel countryside road, a short distance from where she was boarding. The snow had melted, and a local muskrat trapper named Robert Ride was the one to discover her.
I was doing a bit of muskrat trapping at the time. Spring muskrat trapping. I had a long weekend. It was the morning of Good Friday. I was just basically looking for muskrat sign in the water when I came upon the body.
Theresa's scarf was located in a nearby farmer's field, and her wallet was discovered a week later, 10 kilometers from where her body was found. Police transported Theresa's body to Montreal, where an autopsy was performed in order to try and determine her cause of death. John told us that because she'd been in the water for so long, the coroners had a difficult time coming to any conclusions.
Well, they were not able to determine an exact cause of death. She had some food particles in her esophagus. The autopsy said there were no apparent marks on her body of violence. So ultimately, her death is ruled violent death of undetermined means, despite the fact that they do a toxicological report on her internal organs, and nothing comes back to suggest there's any drugs in her system.
There was no signs of drugs found in Theresa's body. Police investigators had speculated that Theresa had possibly died of a drug overdose, that she'd gotten so high that she had taken off her clothes and had died in her sleep. They surmised that later students had discovered her and in a panic moved her body into a car and disposed of her in the nearby creek. When Theresa's classmate Suzanne was questioned about what she thought about that theory, she replied,
And that's crazy. You couldn't kiss a boy on Friday night without the entire campus knowing about it on Saturday morning. There is no way that students could mastermind some kind of massive cover-up like this without anybody knowing about it. It's absolutely impossible. She smoked marijuana, just like most of the kids at that place did, but as far as I know, she did not do anything, take any other drugs than that. She smoked cigarettes.
And John's viewpoint on that theory?
Now, all of this is fantastic, amazing, but there's just one problem. There isn't any proof of it. There's no proof of any of it.
So what happened? Where had Theresa gone after she missed the 6 p.m. shuttle bus that evening on November 3rd, 1978? Had she made an attempt to hitchhike, like she had done so many times before? Had she tried to walk the 15 kilometers back to her residence? Or had she even managed to leave the campus? Why had police and school officials decided not to put together a search party for her at all? Why had they jumped to so many other possible conclusions except for the one that seemed the most probable? Join us for part 2, where we'll discover other conceivable theories behind the disappearance of Theresa Allore and her death, when you'll also hear about a second autopsy report, destroyed evidence, along with a second eyewitness, who was one of the last people to have seen Theresa alive. You'll hear about possible connections to other missing females and unsolved homicides in the same area, along with potential suspects.